Hey, good afternoon, parents. Welcome back to the stream. I hope you guys are having a wonderful day out there today and having a good week. Mine has been pretty busy, as they all seem to be. They all seem to be running together this time of year with various different things going on. I know if you're like me and your children are involved in all kinds of different activities, that definitely keeps you on your toes as well. So we have been extremely swamped in my house, but I always like to try to make time to provide these streams. And I wanted to build today's topic off of a appearance that I had on another podcast earlier this week, in which the host was interviewing me about the book that I wrote, and just kind of going through some of the basic ideas that I lay out in Failure: The History and Results of America's School System. It's been a little over a year now since I wrote and self-published that book. And we were just kind of going through some of the things that I discussed in there. And it even reminded me of some things that I think are really important for us to focus on when we talk about the state of education and schools in America today. And one of the things that I mentioned and brought up is going into there was a part two to the interview. I did part one and then I did part two. And in part two, we really focused on the claims that the system, the schooling system, is broken. I know people argue the language of saying our school's broken because some people will say no, they're not broken. They're doing exactly what they were intended to do. So no, they're not broken. That's why I went with the word failure because regardless of what the goals and outcomes of public education were and have been, and obviously evolved and changed over time, that still at the end of the day, what result we're seeing is failure. And before I kind of jump into that too, I had a unique situation this past week, coming up on about a week ago, where somebody had posted my book on Twitter, just promoting it, saying, give it a read. Here's what it talks about. And some random person jumped on who is an educator up in Canada and just really started attacking the book and me and my work, having clearly not even read anything, saw the cover, probably saw some background, then started social media stalking me. Got really weird. I had to block him on Twitter and Facebook. After I blocked him on Twitter, he followed me over to Facebook, stalked me over there, continued to try to trash me. And I was like, this is not productive. But it kind of made me, though, think a little bit, at least, about the fact that we all have perspectives. He had a different perspective. And I always talk about how I want to embrace dialogue because I understand and know that the message that I am putting out in all of my work, whether it's the articles that I've written, the books that I've written or am writing now, that obviously not everybody is going to agree with me. And that's absolutely okay. In fact, I don't necessarily want everyone to agree with me. I want everyone to at least consider what I have to say. And then at the end of the day, if you agree, great. Let's continue to evolve and build on the message, the core message here about how we, kind of receive education in America, how we look at the role of educating, our youth in America, what that is going to look like, in the future, and so on. But if you don't agree with me, then let's talk about what I've said and break that down, or what maybe your beliefs are, and propose those, and let's have a discussion about that, maybe rather than just trashing somebody's work or themselves, getting into ad hominem attacks and straw man and things of that nature. That's just not productive. And that's basically what my message was to this guy was, look, obviously you're not, you have no, you have no intent here in trying to discuss what I have said or what I am saying. And so I kind of had to let that go, but it did make me at least realize that, and kind of, because sometimes you get that tunnel vision. Sometimes you get that, the way that which you see things, and you live in that worldview and you embrace that. But then sometimes it is kind of a refreshing thing to remember that not everybody sees things the way that you see it. And then, but the thing is like, well, what are we going to do about that then? So as I present my work written in video form, my podcast that I host on a weekly basis called "They Never Taught Me That." Um, whatever the format is, that if you do happen to disagree with something that I say, I'm all for debate and dialogue in a constructive manner. And I think that's something that we're lacking in society today. So it just kind of served as a reminder there. All right, so back to the message then for this week. So again, as I was saying, in the second part of the show that I did this past week, we really dissected the claim that I make that the system and the way in which our modern public schools have evolved is flawed at its core belief, that it was going to provide education to children. That is flawed. It never was set up that way. And in the book, I go through that in the first part. It's a couple of chapters worth of information where we go through and highlight and talk about the roots of our modern school system being tied to the Prussian model of education, which I think a lot of people have kind of started to realize, but not just realizing that, but then looking deeper into what does that mean is I think super important. And I would encourage all of you to go back and see some of what the leadership inside of Prussia was saying as they built their modern school system out. And to see, just to read the language of what their intent was in terms of creating citizens that would be obedient. They didn't want free thinkers. They wanted people that would become, um, patriotic toward Prussia, would follow commands, would essentially be obedient, no matter what, if they went into the military or as a worker in society. They wanted people that could be controlled. They didn't want free thinkers. They didn't want people who would question things, because that was the result that the Prussian government came to as to why they were beat by Napoleon at the Battle of Jena. And they said, our military leadership is too free spirited, too independent. They don't follow directions top down very well. And so it was upon that. And there's lots of scary language embedded in some of the things. There's a man named Johann Gottlieb Fichte that I would encourage you to read. Fichte was someone that I highlight in the book quite a bit, absolutely instrumental in getting the government to assert control over education in Prussia. And as that is brought back over to the US through Horace Mann, and we see the evolution of schools in America, of course, it goes through a lot of iterations. But, at the root of that is the idea that school should be compulsive, that we need to send our children to a school through the force of law, right? Which is what we still have to this very day, that there are truancy laws, and that if you are educating your child the way that the state says that you should, that you can be held legally responsible for that. Now, what I argue, and I do hear this sometimes as pushback from people who are in favor of the public education system, they will say, well, you have choices already. You can do private school, you can do homeschool, you can do charter schools. There are other options out there. But again, my larger point is twofold. Number one, the state still has requirements on how your education looks, even if you pursue those other options, the way in which curriculum is presented, the standards that have to be achieved, and so on and so forth. Even homeschoolers have to provide an equivalent education in the state of Indiana to what a public school would provide. So even that puts some handcuffs and limitations, and quite frankly, some stress on families who have chosen to homeschool. So I think that's an important thing to look at as well. And of course, a lot of times these apologists will say, "Well, yeah, we need the state to tell us how to educate children, so that we have some standard of knowing that a child has been educated in a particular subject manner, a lot of times they will throw out this notion of getting a liberal education, meaning that it's a well-rounded, we do math, science, language arts, foreign language, art, so on and so forth. And so, again, I would push back on that by saying this is a fallacy that I see a lot when discussing the role of government with anything in society. Like if I were to say taxation is theft, then people immediately shoot back with, oh, well, you don't like driving on paved roads, or you must not like hospitals, you must not like schools. And, we always say, like that, I mean, how that's like the lowest level of like comeback against that. It's almost to say like without the government, people in society wouldn't be able to organize and form a system of society that would promote the building of roads and schools and hospitals and other government run programs. I mean, that's just ludicrous, right? I mean, no one thinks that. No one thinks that everybody, once you just abolish government's power in some area, that all of a sudden there's like some kill switch that gets activated. Nobody knows how to do anything. So like all this power is like mystically floating around out there, and only government possesses the knowledge to be able to provide these things to the market. It's just ridiculous, right? I mean, that's just so simple minded to think that, but yet that's one of the very first pushbacks that I get when we talk about removing government control from something. And I've seen increasingly, I think somebody posted, there was a story running around on Facebook just this past week of Terry McAuliffe, who I believe was a part of the Obama administration. And I believe is maybe now governor of Virginia. I know he's got some role in Virginia. I haven't paid close enough attention, but he was saying that, parents shouldn't have a control in their children's education, like, basically at all, let alone like deciding what they learn and things of that nature. And so you couple that with other things we saw just like right as the pandemic was setting in. I know that there were a number of choice advocates who were hot on the tail of some people who were calling for a ban on homeschooling. There were a series of educational specialists who were saying that, just flat out coming out and saying homeschool should be banned. It's already banned in some countries. I think Germany has banned it, and a couple of other European countries have as well. And so they were just, again, kind of highlighting this same notion that, well, parents just simply don't have the tools and the skills to be able to figure out what to teach or how to teach, or, even having the capacity to be able to do it at all. And so, I mean, obviously, they see this enlightened class of educators, again, much like government officials, as being able to possess specific knowledge to educate children that, other people don't have. And of course, again, this idea is also a myth. In fact, most educators who obviously go through formal schooling to become a teacher, if they're being honest, will tell you that most of what they learn in college is simply more management of the classroom as opposed to any kind of techniques or skills in terms of actually educating. And if so, if any of that is done, again, it's done in this idea of a mass system, right? Where, particularly at the secondary level, middle school and high school, you may have 80 to 100, 200 kids throughout the day that you're in charge of educating. And that's just simply not feasible. So when I talk about the structure of education being flawed, these are some of the things that I'm referring to. And these are things that, I think a lot of times we just completely have overlooked. We just pass them off as, well, that's just the way that it is. We can't imagine it in any other way, that, this idea of what we have seen in terms of recent history, consolidating schools into much larger buildings with more kids in them, is not efficient. It's proving and showing that right before our very eyes that, it was labeled that, well, we have to close these, especially in rural areas, close these schools down and force everybody into a building because it's more efficient to do it that way. It may be in terms of some cost benefit analysis of running, multiple buildings or whatnot. But at the end of the day, it's not more efficient in terms of delivering instruction. And it certainly is showing that it's not helping our students to learn information any better. It's not helping our teachers to teach any better. So that's the first thing that I would point out and say is that the way in which the schools are set up is not conducive to being able for the teacher to be able to teach or the student to be able to learn. And we have a long way to go in terms of reimagining what that could or should look like, as opposed to cramming kids into classrooms, into buildings. We have tried and attempted here over the course of the last few years to see the silver bullet of a one-to-one model, where every student has a Chromebook or an iPad as the silver bullet. That's clearly not solving anything. It helps in some ways, but it hurts in other ways. It's just another repackaged model that's being applied to a flawed system. And again, we've seen some schools try to restructure the model of the classroom. Some schools go to block scheduling, some have traditional scheduling. We've seen the move toward embracing magnet schools, especially in inner cities, where within a given district or corporation, there will be schools that are geared towards teaching in a certain manner, like an international baccalaureate, an IB school, or a career and co-op school, or a humanities school, whatever it might be. And, again, that's worthy of trying, but it's, again, not showing any real results in terms of, educating kids. So there's a number of different reforms that are being tried within this model. But again, I always try to tell, and I use this analogy in the show that I appeared on, that, it's like when you try to build on an unstable structure, right? It doesn't matter how good the craftsmanship is, how beautiful the building looks, how much time and detail and attention was put into different parts of building the structure. If the foundation is flawed, eventually the house is going, or the structure is going to crumble or have defects that show up in it. And that's how I equate our public education system or our public school system. It doesn't matter that you build these shiny new buildings, multi-million dollar investments into physical space, and we tout, and we bring the community in, and we have them do tours, and we like to see all the shiny new things and accoutrement inside the building. But that's not changing what kids are being taught, or how they're retaining information, or what they should be getting out of the time that they're spending in the classroom. At the end of the day, the structure that says children are going to attend a school, they're going to be in a building for this amount of time, they're going to be in classrooms for this amount of time, they're going to be getting instruction in this manner, they're going to be taking classes in this way, in this order, they're going to be grouped with their peers by their age. There are all kinds of other daily things that I don't have time to divulge all of them through this video here. But suffice to say that there are things that are happening inside our school buildings every day that again are detrimental to the learning of our children. Okay. Um, Kids that are being included in classrooms that, quite frankly, I'm tired of beating around the bush. They have no business being in a classroom. And I know that sounds harsh in this day and age, but when there are children who have very limited capacity to be able to even understand what is being taught in the classroom, either mentally or emotionally, that's where I see a lot of it. It's more of the emotional maturity or just inability to be able to control themselves that causes the distractions in the building. And what have we seen as a response to this inclusion in the classroom? The rise of non-certified staff, the rise of teachers' aides. That's money that has to be dedicated to having somebody in the classroom. And I think it's a noble and worthy cause. And I don't necessarily, in any way really blame the aides for it. I don't, it's not their fault. They're brought in to help guide these boys and girls through their day. But I remember, a period of time where being in school, there were, isolated spaces where, you could focus more on life skills, where you would be able to have more breakouts. And I could envision that for not only students who have been labeled as special needs, but for kids who just are kind of in this limbo area of not being in accelerated programs, but not necessarily being identified as needing remedial help or special needs, that we see a good chunk, maybe somewhere in the neighborhood of 60 to 70% of our students that are in schools are in this group of not in accelerated, not low enough that they need remediation or identify as special needs, that they are the lost voices. They are the ones that get overlooked because we're paying so much attention to both ends of the spectrum, right? So just that setup alone is again doing a lot of damage in terms of it shuffling kids through the system, and the whole notion of C's get degrees type thing, and not being able to. And again, guys, I don't blame the educators for this. This is not their fault. Now, if you want to challenge that and say, yeah, but they're working in this environment that is holding that up. Okay, I'm with you on that. I think that is a valid point, to say that, if you are an educator and you do realize that the system is set up for students to not learn in the best way possible, and you have to jump through all of these hoops, and we know that, things are constantly being changed on educators in terms of what their expectations are with how they deliver their lesson plans and classroom management and so on and so forth, that if you truly are frustrated enough with that, then yeah, maybe it's time to make your voice heard. Because that's the one thing I've always argued too, is that I really probably feel like even those who support public schools would probably agree with me, and I would probably agree with them on a lot of the issues that we are facing in schools today. It's more of the solutions then to that, where we see kind of a falling out and a disagreement about how we address those issues, right? So, again, those kinds of things are things that we as parents need to consider and think about when we're thinking about what are our children experiencing when they're in school. We often, at least I know I do, can be guilty of this. Think about my sons and their experience in the classroom, how they're behaving, their interaction with the teachers, their assignments, but yet they're being educated in a in kind of a group, a small group, right, in a cohort, so to speak, and that all of those other people in the classroom, adults and children, have an impact and an influence on how they are experiencing their learning in the classroom, right? So clearly, the way in which the teacher presents the lessons, you'll hear kids all the time say, I just can't learn from that teacher and their style. Maybe they rely too much on auditory, direct instruction. Maybe they're too scatterbrained, and or their logic doesn't pair up well with the way in which you're receiving information. I'm seeing that right now with one of my sons in relation to math curriculum, where he comes home and he says, I just don't understand the way that she's showing us how to do things, and I'm really confused. And then I have to try to explain it the way that I know it. And if that doesn't align with the way the teacher is showing it, now he's even more confused, right? So again, all of these things factor in, and I could go on and on and on about, the curriculum and the way that it's designed is another thing that is again detrimental to the way in which we learn. It's presented in a very confusing manner. It's just this series of information that we are just trying to cram into their heads without giving them the opportunity to make sense of it. And if you know anything about the way that children learn, and I use that word children to mean even at the high school level, right? That humans in general have to be able to make sense of what they're learning, right? I mean, think about that. If you are just presented with a bunch of information at your job, and then your boss were to say, okay, we're gonna make sure that you retained everything that we just taught you, and then that was the end of it, right? You learned how to do processes, you learned standard operating procedures, you learned the company culture, so you went through the handbook and you read everything, and they gave you a test and you passed the test, and then they just said, okay, good job, go get them. And you go get them how? Like, what do I do with this knowledge? How do I apply what I just learned? Am I left alone to figure that out on my own? And then that can be frustrating, right? If you've got no guidance or suggestions about how to go about doing your job without being modeled or again given any feedback or framework for how to do it, that's essentially school, right? For 12 years, we just fill with information. And again, some will say, well, there's project-based learning, and there are times where they do get to apply it. Those are very few and far between. This needs to be front and center of how we are educating our children. The entire system needs to be focused and built upon the idea of application of learning. That should be the number one priority, that no matter what content wise we're learning, if we can't apply it, if we can't make sense of what we're supposed to do with it, then why learn it? And so you might say, well, again, it's building blocks. They like to say scaffolding, that kind of thing. There again, for a kid who is trying to make sense of what they're learning, and let me give you an example here of what I mean, this is going to be a very hard sell. So, like, take for example, when a student is in elementary school and they're learning their multiplication tables, right? And they're just memorizing. That's all it is. Worksheet after worksheet, drill, 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 time test, everything. You get it to where you've done enough problems correctly within a period of time, move on to the next one. And then you repeat that cycle. And then at the end of that, what do you have? You have, maybe, if you've retained it long enough to be able to reproduce it on the paper. But then let's say 6 months from now, 9 months from now, a year from now, can you reproduce that same level of work? And a lot of kids lose that, and we have to go back and reteach it, right? So you spent all this time building up, learning how to do multiplication tables, but then they forget it because they're not doing anything with it. And even if they're using it to solve problems on homework, to them, that's a task. That's just the same thing as saying, like, I need you to pick up your room or clean up after dinner or fold this load of laundry or whatever. They're going to first gravel their way through it. And then when they do it, they just want to do it to get it done with it. They're not actively engaged with it. They're not going through the process of going like, okay, let me learn about how to do this the right way. So when you take this content that you've taught them in regards to, in this case, multiplication tables, there's no real world application to that. That's why there's learning loss. That's why they struggle through it. That's why they fight it so much. Now take that and multiply that, no pun intended, to other content, right? Where they're learning things about in science and nature, and eventually through biology and chemistry and whatnot, or other things in math, or the one that I engage with a lot is history. We don't teach kids history up until they get into middle school, right? I mean, you might have a little bit sprinkled in upper elementary school, but I think sixth grade, at least in my state, is the first time a student has a standalone social studies class. And so now you just jump into talking about world civilizations and culture and government and all of these really pretty heavy topics, and they have no framework to be able to understand it. And so, again, to them, that's one of the reasons why I believe they end up not really attaching to that. They don't really like it very much. Now, imagine if they had more of an opportunity to learn about culture and society and governments and history and whatnot, more than just a one-off project, learning about a state or learning your state capitals or whatever it might have been that you did, when you were in elementary school related to history or social studies, and that you would be able to immerse yourself in that. How much more that would mean, how much more you would retain from that. That's what education is: immersing yourself in the content, giving yourself some freedom to be able to choose what you learn, when you learn, and how you learn it. And again, I know that students aren't formed cognitively enough to be able to make all of those decisions. That's what the parents are there for. And if the parents can't do it, there are community minded options that exist. If a parent feels completely overwhelmed to be able to educate their child, there are co-ops, there are other forms of schools that don't require or aren't set up the exact way that a public school is. Now, at the end of the day, they're trying to hit the same kind of thing as I mentioned earlier, but they're able to do it in a much more creative and flexible environment. And that's what we should really be looking at when we look at moving on from the model in which our public schools have. Because again, as I've always said, and I will continue to maintain this, if a public school's working for you and your family, great. I think that's fantastic. Stick with it. More power to you. But I do think that if it's not, it should be more freely open for you to be able to pursue a model that works better for you and your family. And so I think that we have to make sure that we are advocating for ourselves any system that would provide us the opportunity to educate our children in the way that we see best. And again, I think when we look at the results of our public schools, it clearly is indicating that it's not working. And that's what I wanted to kind of wrap up with today in this message is, don't just take my word for it. And I've got all kinds of data in my book that showcases and highlights the fact that children aren't learning. You can look at the data out there related to testing, or not even just testing, but just overall aptitude, preparedness once they graduate from high school. Colleges are speaking out, and admissions counselors and professors are saying the students that are coming to our campus are completely unprepared. Mentally, they don't have the capacity to learn. They're not academically. They haven't endured academic rigor enough. Mentally, they're pretty weak. They're not able to uh, push through turmoil and tough times, right? And so that all of that stuff is out there to showcase and show that our schools are failing. In addition to that, we see a number of stories that highlight what I call fake graduation rates. There was famously a school in, I believe, Baltimore or Washington, D.C., called Ballou High School, where every student was proposed to have graduated from that school. And when they started looking into it, initially it was celebrated. They had this big thing. Hey, congratulations, we made it. It was a at-risk school. They touted that they were able to get everybody to graduate. And they started digging a little bit deeper. And they found that there were students that never attended class, students who had failed all their classes were still awarded diplomas. So there's stories like that are coming out more and more frequently. More recent, the governor of Oregon recently signed a bill into law out there that is temporarily suspending state standards for schools. And again, there were stories out of, I think it was Virginia or New York, where they are doing away with accelerated programs, AP classes, because of equity concerns. And what is this doing? It's watering down the curriculum, right? What little they are getting is being watered down now. So there's all kinds of stories out there. And I think in the book, I also, that I wrote, highlight this too, that I have personally seen and can attest to students who were awarded grades, and I specifically say that because they weren't earned; they were awarded passing grades that I can attest to saying they weren't proficient in that content. There was pressure to make sure that they did enough technically to get the grade, right? So, situation where you get down to the nitty gritty and it's like a government or an econ student, and the guidance counselors start reaching out, say, hey, what can we do to make sure that this student passes? Or have you talked with the parents? And of course, it's like, yeah, I have, and nothing has changed, right? So, okay, well, let's see what we can do to help them out. So, as an educator, as a teacher, you have to go back and put all of this additional work together that has not been done throughout the year, give them another opportunity to do it, award them the credit, get the numbers to work right to where they get this, D minus or whatever, and they can pass the class and graduate, right? And there's never any pause for concern to say, we're awarding somebody a diploma that is in some way built off the idea that they just went through the hoops enough to be able to get a D minus in the class, but yet their diploma carries the same weight as somebody who did all of the work first the right way, probably with more detail, probably with more due diligence. That what does that mean for the person who did all that and got the diploma the same way as those who got this? I call it special treatment. Again, I want to be clear that I never was challenged or forced to change a failing grade to a passing grade, but I was encouraged to present opportunities for that failing student to be brought up to a passing grade. And again, we have to have these conversations. It's not enough just to acknowledge that. I mean, yes, you have to acknowledge that, but we have to say, what does that mean? What is the implication of that? Right? There is something to that we need to talk about in terms of what that means for students who are going through our courses in our schools today. And again, this isn't just conjecture on my part. There's data out there. There are all kinds of stories out there to say what it means is that we have increasingly more and more students who are graduating from our schools who are completely unprepared for either college or the workforce. And that should be the number one goal of, in my opinion, education, preparing you for life, whatever journey that might be. And that could look like a number of different pathways. But if you don't have the skills, right, the core, skills to be able to lead a productive life as an adult now, we are failing. We are letting you down. And we have to stop and say enough of the bickering about the amount of dollars or the curriculum or who controls this or who controls that. You get one shot at being educated in this life. And we are simply shuffling too many of our children through the system. And it is leading to a cumulative harm in our society that we have to address. We are at a crisis point where, we're talking about now generations that have been negatively impacted by this. Okay. So that's, I think, what we need to be focused on. I think we need to spend a lot more time in our dialogue breaking down what structure schools have and the harm that it's doing to children as they are exposed to this for years, very valuable years, by the way, formative years of their lives. And what could it look like to be more productive? So again, that's what I think we should try to advocate for as we move forward. Let's really think about what our students are experiencing and how, beyond mask mandates, beyond even just debates about curriculum, which are important, to think about what it is we need to do to provide our students with the best learning experience possible. All right, so that's going to do it for this week's message. Again, I thank you guys so much for all your support. If you are liking the content that I am putting out, please feel free to follow my podcast that I have. They Never Taught Me That. You can find that on Facebook. The actual podcast is available through Google and Apple Podcasts. It's on the Spreaker Radio app. You can find it over there as well. I am putting these weekly messages together in live streams. If you have a suggestion for a topic that you'd like for me to cover, feel free to push that over my way as well. You can follow me on Facebook at Justin Spears and the number 4. The same thing on Twitter as well. So thank you guys so much. Have a great day. We'll see you next week.